They locked him in with the feral alien girl. Days later, they found her asleep on his chest. The shove was brutally efficient, a piston of armored muscle slamming into his back. Ephraim stumbled forward, his worn combat boots skidding on a floor slick with grime and something colder. He caught his balance just as the world behind him vanished. A deep, resonant clang of locking mechanisms echoed in the sudden darkness, a sound of absolute finality that vibrated through the metal deck and up into the bones of his feet. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale blood, and the sharp metallic tang of misery. He was a piece of cargo, delivered and sealed. A sound cut through the oppressive dark. It was low and guttural, a growl that wasn't just animalistic but profoundly wounded. It came from the far corner of the space, a place where the shadows were deepest. Ephraim remained perfectly still, letting his eyes adjust, his training taking over. Fear was a luxury, a waste of energy. Analysis was survival. He cataloged the sounds, the menacing rumble in a chest, yes, but also a faint, wet rasp between breaths. It was a sound he knew intimately from field hospitals and ambushed patrols. It was the sound of compromised lungs, of fluid and pain. He also noted a small circular vent near the ceiling, currently silent, likely the cell's only source of recycled air. He slowly lowered his pack from his shoulder, the soft scrape of canvas against his armor deafening in the silence. He set it down without a thud. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady, pitched to soothe, not to challenge. He spoke in the guttural trade language of the outer systems, the lingua franca of mercenaries and slavers. The only response was a sharp hiss and the sound of claws or something like them scraping against the metal floor. A warning. A faulty light panel directly overhead flickered, a dying pulse of weak blue-white light. It was just for a second, a strobing, fragmented glimpse into the corner. It was enough. He saw a figure, feminine in shape, huddled against the wall. The skin was a shocking, vibrant shade of pink, marred by dirt and dried blood. Long, silver hair, matted and filthy, cascaded over her shoulders, and two pointed ears, feline and expressive, were flattened against her skull in a posture of pure aggression. Her eyes, wide and luminous, caught the light and blazed a fierce feral gold. A Kytan. He'd only ever seen them in intel reports. A warrior race, famed for their lethal grace, their unyielding loyalty. She was coiled like a spring, her body clad in a tattered, form-fitting suit that had once been a work of art, but was now just another layer of filth. The light died, plunging him back into darkness. The after-image of her golden eyes burned onto his retinas. The growling intensified, closer now. He could hear her shifting, the scrape of her feet on the deck. She was stalking him in the pitch black. He didn't move. He kept his breathing even, controlled. The syndicate overseer, a bloated Xylosian named Vorlag, had sneered as his guards pushed him toward this cell. "The champion is feeling antisocial," the creature had rasped, its translator implant buzzing with amusement. "We're taking bets on how long a soft-bodied medic lasts." The light flickered again, longer this time. She was 10 feet away, crouched low, a predator ready to pounce. Her lips were pulled back from her teeth in a silent snarl. He saw it then, the reason for the rasping breath. A jagged tear in her suit, just below her ribcage on the left side. The area around it was dark, swollen, the edges of the wound angry and inflamed. It was a mess, a deep puncture left to fester. The source of her rage wasn't just trauma, it was septicemia. She was burning with a fever that was boiling her mind. He let out a slow breath, the air fogging in the cell's chill. He was locked in a cage with a cornered, wounded animal, one of the most dangerous predators in the known galaxy. But his focus narrowed, the medic in him overriding the soldier. The problem wasn't the predator, it was the infection. His first priority wasn't surviving her, it was diagnosing her. He met her blazing golden eyes in the next pulse of light, and for the first time since the cell door slammed shut, he felt a flicker of something other than clinical detachment. It was a sliver of hope. She was a patient, and he was a healer. This was a language he knew how to speak. The darkness was her ally, a familiar cloak for her pain and rage. Ephraim understood this. He didn't try to force an interaction. He remained in his spot, a solid, unmoving presence that was neither a threat nor a challenge. He waited for the strobing light, using each precious second to gather more data. The wound was bad, worse than he initially thought. The swelling extended up her side, indicating a deep systemic infection. The fever was likely causing delirium, paranoia. The creature they called feral was a soldier dying slowly of a treatable injury. The cruelty of it settled in his stomach like a cold stone. He carefully unsealed a hidden, biosealed seam in the liner of his worn armored vest, a feature designed to get critical supplies past enemy scans. Inside, cushioned by synth fabric, was his last resort kit. It wasn't much. A single-dose injector of a general, broad-spectrum antibiotic, 2 antiseptic wipes, a high-density nutrient paste, and 2 packets of purified water. They'd taken everything else. This was all he had left. Here it was a miracle. He laid each item out on the clean side of his pack canvas, his movements slow and deliberate. "My name is Ephraim," he said again into the darkness, his voice calm. "I'm a medic. I see that you're hurt. I want to help." A low growl was his only answer. He took one of the water packets. During the next flicker of light, he held it up, showing it to her, then placed it on the floor. He gave it a gentle slide. The plastic pouch skated across the grimy deck, stopping a few feet from her crouched form. She didn't move. He retreated to his original position and sat, his back against the cold wall, making himself smaller. He opened the second packet for himself, drinking slowly, audibly. Minutes stretched into an eternity, marked only by the erratic pulse of the failing light. Then, in the dark, he heard it, a faint scraping sound, a quick, darting movement. When the light flashed again, the water packet was gone. She was back in her corner, the empty pouch on the floor beside her. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. His next move was more direct. He took out an antiseptic wipe, tore the foil with his teeth, and began cleaning a long, shallow cut on his own forearm from when the guards had subdued him. He worked methodically, his face impassive, showing her his tools, demonstrating their purpose. Healing, not harming. She watched him, her golden eyes tracking every movement, the low growl in her chest a constant, vibrating hum. He saved the nutrient paste for last. He squeezed a small amount onto his finger and ate it, then held the tube out. He didn't move. He waited. This was the true test. She needed calories to fight the infection as much as she needed medicine. The standoff was absolute. He remained still, arm outstretched, a silent offering in the oppressive gloom. The light panel flickered, died, then flickered again. On the third flash, she moved. She didn't rush. She uncoiled from her corner with a fluid grace that even her injuries couldn't completely hide. She crossed the space between them in a low crouch, her every muscle tensed. She stopped just out of his reach, her head low, her silver hair hiding her face. He could smell the fever on her, a sickly sweet scent layered over the smell of blood. He didn't move, didn't even breathe. He just held the tube steady. Slowly, cautiously, she leaned forward. Her pink lips parted, and she licked the paste from his finger, her tongue surprisingly soft against his skin. Her eyes never left his. They were inches apart now. He could see the fine dark markings on her skin, like subtle tribal tattoos woven into her flesh. He could see the pain dulling the fire in her gaze. She took another taste, then another, before abruptly retreating to her corner. Progress. Now for the hardest part. He capped the nutrient tube and reached for the antibiotic injector. He stood up slowly, telegraphing his every intention. "The wound," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The infection is in your blood. It's confusing you. Let me look." He took a single, slow step toward her. The growl returned, louder, sharper, a clear warning. But she didn't lash out. She held her ground, her body coiled, her golden eyes locked on his. The part ended with him taking another deliberate step, closing the distance, entering the lion's den with nothing but the hope that the patient inside could see past the pain. The air crackled with tension. Each step Ephraim took was a negotiation, a gamble measured in inches. He stopped just beyond her reach, went down on one knee to reduce his height, and waited. The strobing light cast their tableau in stark, dramatic flashes. The kneeling human, the coiled Kytan. He could see the rapid, shallow rise and fall of her chest, the tremors running through her limbs. "There is metal in the wound," he said, his voice a low, clinical murmur. "A piece of shrapnel, maybe. It's poisoning you. I have to get it out." He held up the injector, then set it aside. First, the source had to be removed. He unlatched the gauntlet on his right arm. With a sharp twist, he broke off a thin plate along a pre-scored line, an emergency feature of his armor, designed to create a crude cutting edge. Her eyes tracked the glint of durasteel, and a deep snarl ripped from her throat. "This will hurt," he said, his voice full of a regret that was entirely genuine. "I'm sorry, but it is the only way." He moved before she could react, not with aggression, but with a swift, practiced motion designed to secure and soothe. He closed the final distance, his left arm wrapping around her back, his hand pressing firmly against her uninjured side. His right hand, holding the sharpened plate, went to the wound. She exploded. A wave of raw, fever-fueled strength crashed against him. A piercing shriek tore through the cell as she thrashed, her claws scoring lines of fire across his armored vest. He held on, his body absorbing her desperate struggles. He was larger, heavier, his armor giving him the advantage. He pinned her against the wall, his weight trapping her, his voice a constant stream of reassurance in her ear. "It's all right. I've got you. Just hold still. It will be over soon. I've got you." His words were a lie and a prayer. He didn't know if it would be all right, but it was his duty to try. With her pinned, he brought the makeshift scalpel to the edge of the swollen, angry wound. He had to be fast. He made the cut. She screamed again, a sound of pure agony that clawed at his soul and arched against him with extraordinary strength. He gritted his teeth, his muscles straining to hold her. The scent of fresh blood, hot and coppery, filled the air. He probed the incision with his fingers, the heat of her body searing his skin through his gloves. His fingers found it, a jagged, twisted piece of metal, hooked into the muscle beneath. He had to get it out. He gripped the shard, braced himself, and pulled. She convulsed violently, a raw cry of pain muffled against his shoulder. For a horrifying second, he felt her teeth graze his neck, but it wasn't a bite. It was the desperate clamping of a jaw against unbearable torment. Then the shrapnel came free, slick with blood and pus. He flung it away, the metal clattering uselessly against the far wall. He didn't let her go. He kept her pinned, his arm a steel band around her, while his free hand fumbled for the antibiotic injector. He found it, uncapped it with his teeth, and plunged the needle into her thigh. He depressed the plunger, sending the life-saving medicine surging into her system. The fight went out of her all at once. Her body went limp, her full weight slumping against him. The shrieks subsided into ragged, exhausted sobs. Her head rested on his shoulder, her silver hair a curtain against his cheek. He held her, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. The price of healing had been a brutal violation, an act of violence to stave off a slower death. He didn't know if she would ever trust him again. But as he felt the tremors in her body finally begin to subside, he knew he had made the right choice. She was alive. For now, that was enough. A full cycle of the station's dim artificial lights passed. The cell was no longer a cage for two enemies, but a recovery room. The raw, violent tension had bled away, replaced by a quiet, shared exhaustion. Ephraim had used the last of his antiseptic wipes to clean the now-closed wound as best he could, and had secured a patch of canvas from his pack over it as a crude bandage. She had not fought him. She had lain still, her golden eyes watching his every move. The feral haze finally gone, replaced by a sharp, piercing intelligence that unnerved him more than her rage ever had. The fever had broken, leaving her weak and drenched in sweat, but her breathing was deep and even. He had given her the last of the nutrient paste, which she accepted from his fingers without hesitation. A fragile, unspoken truce had formed in the crucible of her pain and his resolve. He sat with his back against the wall, watching her rest. She had not retreated to her corner, but lay a few feet from him, her body still tense but no longer coiled to strike. Progress. That was when he heard the hiss. It came from the small, circular vent near the ceiling. A thin, vaporous mist, carrying a sickly sweet scent like overripe fruit and burnt sugar, began to snake its way into the cell. Ephraim was on his feet in an instant, his blood running cold. He knew that smell. Xylosian rage gas. A combat stimulant designed to bypass higher brain functions and trigger the primal, aggressive instincts of any oxygen-breathing species. It was a weapon of terror, used to make soldiers fight beyond pain, beyond exhaustion, beyond reason. Vorlog, cheated of his bloody spectacle, had decided to force the issue. No, he whispered, turning toward her. Her head snapped up, her feline ears twitching. Her pupils, which had returned to normal, dilated into black pools. A low, guttural growl rumbled in her chest, deeper and more menacing than before. She got to her feet, her movements jerky, unnatural. The gas was hitting her system, hijacking her body. She screamed a high, thin sound of confusion and agony and clawed at her own temples. The rage was back, but this time it was different. It wasn't the product of fever and pain. It was a chemical fire, an artificial storm of pure, unadulterated aggression. She launched herself at him, a pink and silver blur of claws and teeth. He didn't meet her attack with force. He sidestepped, absorbing the blow on his armored shoulder, and wrapped his arms around her, pinning her arms to her sides. He spun them both, slamming their backs against the wall, using his body as a shield in a cage. She thrashed against him, a caged hurricane of fury, her snarls wet and desperate against his neck. "Fight it," he grunted, his voice a raw plea to the woman he knew was still in there. "Don't let them do this. Stay with me." He couldn't overpower her for long. The drug gave her unnatural strength. He had to end this, now. He had one option, a desperate medical technique for counteracting neurotoxins, a nerve cluster overload. It was precise, dangerous, and intensely intimate. He shifted his grip, one hand cupping the back of her head, forcing her face toward his. Her golden eyes were blazing with a light that wasn't her own. With his free hand, he found the pressure points at the base of her skull, his thumb and forefinger digging in with practiced, forceful precision. At the same time, his other thumb pressed hard against the nerve bundle just below her ear. Her body went rigid, a choked cry catching in her throat. The thrashing stopped. He held the pressure, his face inches from hers, their breaths mingling in the poisoned air. He saw the chemical fire in her eyes flicker, then recede, pushed back by a wave of her own indomitable will. Her focus shifted. She wasn't looking through him anymore. She was looking at him, her pupils constricted, the intelligent gold returning. Her lips parted, and a single, raspy word escaped, a sound that shattered the drug-fueled chaos. "Ephraim." The gas thinned, its cloying sweetness dissipating into the foul air of the cell, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. She sagged in his arms, the last of the stimulant's monstrous strength abandoning her. She was a dead weight, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the ordeal. He held her, lowering them both to the floor until they were sitting against the wall, her form still half-cradled in his lap. The intimacy of the position was secondary to the sheer necessity of the support. "You knew my name," he stated, his voice rough with spent adrenaline. She lifted her head from his shoulder, her movements slow, exhausted. Her golden eyes were clear, lucid, and filled with a depth of sorrow that stole his breath. "I have known it since you first spoke it," she rasped, her voice unused, fragile as old parchment. "I heard everything, I saw everything, but I was a passenger, drowning." The confession hung between them, heavy and profound. She hadn't been a feral beast. She had been a prisoner in her own body, a conscious mind trapped behind a wall of septic delirium, watching as her limbs acted on primal instinct. She had watched him tend to his own wounds. She had watched him offer her water. She had felt every agonizing second of the surgery, and every gentle touch of his hands as he cleaned the wound afterward. She had been aware, screaming into a void, unable to stop her body from trying to tear him apart. The thought was horrifying. "My name is Eineida," she said, her voice gaining a fraction more strength. "Eineida," he repeated. It felt right, solid, a name for a warrior. They talked. The words came slowly at first, then like a floodgate opening. She told him of her life before this cage. She was first blade to the Kytan matriarch, a sworn protector. They had been ambushed by Xylosian slavers. She had fought, but they had used sonic disruptors. She remembered the pain of the shrapnel tearing into her side, the faces of her sisters falling around her, the final, horrifying image of the matriarch being dragged away in chains. Her failure wasn't just a tactical loss, it was a spiritual wound, a stain on her soul. He listened, a knot tightening in his chest. He understood the burden of failure, the ghosts of comrades lost. He told her about his own squad. "We were a small rapid response unit," he explained, his voice low. "Just a medic, an engineer, a comms tech. But in a team that small, you learn each other's jobs. I can patch a comms relay and she could set a bone. We had to. He spoke of the ambush on a routine medical transport by pirates. They'd found no high-value targets and had sold the survivors to the first bidder. He spoke of the guilt of being the only one to make it out, even as a prisoner. Their stories were different, from opposite ends of the galaxy, but they were woven with the same threads of duty, loss, and survival. The grimy cell became a sanctuary, a confessional. The physical proximity that had been born of violence and necessity was slowly transforming. When she shivered from the lingering chill of the shock, he instinctively pulled her closer, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. She didn't resist. She leaned into his warmth, a silent gesture of acceptance, of trust. He was no longer just her medic. She was no longer just his patient. They were two soldiers, two survivors, finding a moment of fragile peace in the heart of their shared hell. The bond between them, forged in pain and sealed by her name, was becoming something far deeper, something that neither of them had a name for yet. Their fragile peace was shattered not by a sound, but by the lack of one. The soft hiss of the recycler vent cutting off, the subtle hum of the nutrient dispenser failing to activate at the designated time. Vorlag was retaliating. A voice, distorted and cruel, crackled through a hidden speaker. "The sponsors are displeased," the Zelosian's voice buzzed. "They paid for blood, not conversation. Enjoy the quiet. We find dehydration and starvation make for a much more motivated performance." The speaker clicked off. The silence that followed was heavier, more menacing than before. They were cut off. A new enemy had entered the cell, time. Eineida pushed herself away from him, her strength returning with a fierce, defiant energy. "He thinks this will break us," she said, her voice no longer fragile but laced with cold steel. "He is a fool. He has only given us a weapon." "What weapon?" Ephraim asked, watching her. "A deadline," she answered, her golden eyes scanning every inch of their prison with a new, analytical light. "Now we know the game has changed. We are no longer waiting. We are preparing." The dynamic shifted instantly. They were a unit. Her lethargy was replaced by a coiled, dangerous grace. His weariness was burned away by a surge of tactical focus. They began to work, their movements synchronized, their thoughts seeming to run on a parallel track. He examined the door, testing the seams, analyzing the locking mechanism from what little he could see. She ran her hands over the walls, her sensitive fingertips searching for vibrations, for hollow spots, for any structural weakness a brute like Vorlag would have overlooked. "The floor panels are weaker at the junctions," she reported, tapping a spot with her knuckle, held by magnetic clamps. "Powerful, but if we could disrupt the power feed..." "We could pry one loose," Ephraim finished, his mind already racing. "The power conduits for the clamps should run beneath them. If I can get to them, I might be able to create a short, a power surge." Their collaboration was seamless. His knowledge of field repairs complemented her intimate understanding of the station's brutalist Xylosian construction. They spoke in a shorthand of tactical plans and engineering principles. The cell became a workshop. He used the sharpened edge of his broken gauntlet plate to begin worrying at the sealant around a floor panel she had identified as the weakest. She, in turn, began unraveling threads from the tattered remains of her suit, weaving them into a thin, strong cord. The air between them, once charged with fear and pain, now crackled with a different kind of energy. It was the intensity of two professionals working in perfect concert. But it was more than that. As he worked, kneeling on the floor, she would crouch beside him, her presence a silent, steadying force. The brush of her arm against his, the way her silver hair fell across his shoulder as she leaned in to point out a flaw in the metal, the shared, focused gleam in their eyes, it all wove a new layer of intimacy. This was a different kind of closeness, not born of healing or comfort, but of a shared purpose, a unified will. They were forging an alliance, and with it something far more dangerous to their captors. They were forging a weapon of two. And in the heat of that forge, the unspoken tension between them was being tempered into a bond as strong as durasteel. Days bled into one another, measured only by the growing ache of hunger in their bellies and the parched, raw feeling in their throats. They worked in shifts, one resting while the other chipped away at their monumental task. They had managed to pry up a corner of the floor panel, exposing the thick, insulated power conduits beneath. Hope, raw and potent, was now their only sustenance. They learned each other in the quiet moments between the labor. He learned the specific cadence of her breathing, the way her feline ears would twitch just before a guard patrol passed their door. She learned the set of his jaw when he was concentrating, the surprising gentleness in his hands as he redressed her wound with a cleaner strip of canvas. They shared no more stories of their past, only a focus on the future, a future that extended no further than the other side of the cell door. The speaker crackled to life, startling them both. Vorlog's voice oozed with sadistic pleasure. "Showtime," it buzzed. "Your debut in the Grand Arena is in 1 hour, the executioner's hour. Try not to disappoint." 1 hour. The deadline was no longer a strategic advantage. It was a ticking clock. A silent, frantic energy filled the cell. He worked faster at the conduit, stripping the insulation with his makeshift blade. She finished weaving her cord, testing its strength, her knuckles white. Their preparations were swift, economical, each movement honed by days of planning. In the final few minutes, with the work done, a profound stillness descended. They stood in the center of the cell, the shadows hiding nothing between them. The unspoken feelings, the raw, magnetic pull that had been growing since she first spoke his name, became an unbearable pressure. He reached out, his hand tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing against her lips. Her pink skin was warm, alive. She leaned into his touch, her golden eyes holding his. He saw no fear in them, only a fierce, unwavering resolve that mirrored his own. She reached up, her own hand covering his, her slender fingers lacing with his. Then she brought her other hand to his pauldron, her fingers tracing the dents and scratches, each one a story of a battle survived. A story that had led him here to her. The air was thick with words that would never be spoken, words of fear, of hope, of a connection that felt ancient and absolute. There was no time for them. There was only now. He lowered his head, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision, a desperate, ravenous claiming. It was the raw fury of two caged animals, the defiant roar of two soldiers on the eve of a battle they were not expected to survive. His hands tangled in her silver hair, pulling her closer, his lips bruising hers. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her body pressing against his, a perfect fit. It tasted of desperation and dust, of sweat and an unspoken promise. It was a seal, a sacrament, a vow made in the language of touch. If this was to be their end, they would face it together. If they were to die, they would die as one. The kiss broke, leaving them breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The sound of heavy bolts being drawn back on their cell door was the only sound in the universe. They did not pull apart. They turned as one to face it. The heavy door shrieked open on rusted hinges, flooding the cell with the harsh, sterile light of the corridor. 4 hulking Xylosian guards, clad in black chitinous armor and armed with shock mauls, filled the entrance. Behind them, partially obscured, stood Vorlog. His wide, frog-like mouth was stretched into a sneer of anticipation, his multiple small eyes blinking rapidly. "Time to earn your keep," he rasped, gesturing with a fleshy hand. "Drag them out." The guards moved forward, their expressions bored and brutal. They expected 2 starved, weakened prisoners, easy to subdue. They did not expect the silent, unified pair that stood waiting. They did not expect the look in their eyes. The explosion of violence was breathtaking in its speed and efficiency. The first guard who reached for Eineida found his wrist seized in a grip of unreal strength. She twisted, using his own momentum against him, and slammed him face first into the wall with a sickening crunch. As he crumpled, she launched herself off the wall, a whirlwind of controlled fury. Her movements were not the thrashing of a feral beast, but the precise, lethal ballet of a master warrior. A high kick shattered the helmet of the second guard, sending him staggering back into his companion. Simultaneously, Ephraim moved. He was not a whirlwind, he was an anchor, a tactician. As the third guard swung his shock maul, Ephraim dropped low, grabbing the corner of the loosened floor panel. With a grunt of exertion, he heaved it upwards. The heavy plate caught the guard under the chin, snapping his head back. Ephraim was already moving, yanking the live power conduit from its housing. As the fourth guard charged, he whipped the sparking cable like a bullwhip. It coiled around the guard's metal armor. The Xylosian convulsed, lit from within by a blue-white light, and collapsed, smoke pouring from the joints of his suit. It was over in less than 10 seconds. Vorlog stared, his sneer frozen on his face, his small eyes wide with disbelief. Ephraim stood over the sparking conduit, his chest heaving. Eineida stood amidst the fallen guards, her posture radiating deadly grace. They were a perfect unit, her ferocity and his ingenuity, her speed and his strength. "Impossible," Vorlog stammered, taking a step back. They advanced on him, out of the cell and into the corridor, their steps falling into perfect sync. Their breakout was a spark. From other cells down the block, other gladiators, beings from a dozen different conquered worlds, had been watching. They saw the guards fall. They saw the feared overseer stumble back in terror. A single roar went up from a massive furred creature 2 cells down. It was answered by another and another. An old, one-eyed Zokar warrior reached through the energy bars of his cell, his powerful hand closing around the control panel on the wall. With a guttural scream of effort, he ripped it from its moorings. Sparks flew, shorting out the local grid. The energy bars flickered and died. The Zokar slammed his shoulder into the door, which groaned and buckled. Seeing this, others began to batter their own doors, the weakened locks giving way one by one in a chain reaction of rebellion. The unchaining had begun. Gladiators, warriors, and slaves poured into the corridor, a tidal wave of fury and hope. At its crest were Ephraim and Eineida, no longer prisoners, but the heart of the uprising. The rebellion spread through the bowels of the arena like wildfire. The gladiators, armed with improvised weapons and the sheer force of their desperation, overwhelmed the first waves of syndicate guards. It was chaos, a maelstrom of violence and cathartic rage, but it lacked direction. Ephraim saw it instantly. They were a mob, not an army. They would be contained and slaughtered if they didn't have a focus. "The spire!" he yelled to Eineida over the din of battle. "Vorlag's control spire. It overlooks the entire arena. He controls the gates, the systems, everything from there." She understood immediately. While the others fought for revenge, they would fight for victory. They broke from the main group, moving with a shared purpose through the labyrinthine corridors beneath the arena. They were a scalpel cutting through the chaos. When they met resistance, Eineida was the blade, a fluid arc of motion that disabled and disarmed with ruthless efficiency. Ephraim was the hand guiding it. He spotted weaknesses in the guards' formations, pointed out environmental hazards they could use, and kept them moving toward their objective. He was the strategist. She was the beautiful, terrible execution of that strategy. They fought their way up a service stairwell, emerging into the main arena itself. The vast, sand-covered floor was a scene of pandemonium, but high above it all, encased in triple-thick plasteel, was the control spire, a tyrant's throne room. Vorlog was inside, frantically barking orders into his comms, his face a mask of panic. "The access ramp is retracting," Eineida shouted, pointing to the bridge leading to the spire. "I can bypass it," Ephraim yelled back, his cross-training kicking in. He sprinted toward a nearby environmental control panel, ripping the cover off. His fingers flew across the circuits. He didn't need to be delicate. He jammed the metal shard from his gauntlet across 2 primary circuits. "Get ready!" The massive dust extractors lining the arena roared to life, but in reverse. A blinding, choking sandstorm erupted from the floor, engulfing the loyalist guards who were trying to form a defensive line around the spire. The arena lights flickered and strobed erratically, disorienting them further. Under the cover of the chaos he had created, they raced for the spire. The final confrontation took place in the cramped confines of the control room. Vorlag, seeing them breach the door, drew a wickedly curved energy blade. He was larger than Ephraim, bloated but powerful. He lunged, not at the armored human, but at Eineida, the source of his humiliation. "Feral beast," he bellowed, "I will mount your head on my wall." Eineida met his charge. It was not a battle, it was a reckoning. She flowed around his clumsy, powerful swings, her movements economical and deadly. She did not snarl or scream. Her face was a mask of cold, focused calm. This was not the mindless rage he had tried to weaponize. This was the disciplined fury of a warrior whose honor, whose very soul, had been restored. Ephraim stood guard at the door, his makeshift sparking conduit held at the ready, ensuring no one could interfere. It was her fight to win. The duel ended with Vorlog disarmed, the energy blade clattering to the floor. He stared at Eineida, his chest heaving, his many eyes wide with fear. She stood over him, not with a weapon, but with the sheer force of her presence. She had defeated him. She had reclaimed herself. She turned away from him, leaving him broken and defeated amidst the wreckage of his little empire, and walked back to Ephraim. Her victory was complete. The battle was over. The roar of the uprising had faded into the organized sounds of liberation. Down below, on the sands of the arena, the freed gladiators were securing the gates, tending to the wounded, and forging the first fragile bonds of a new community. The syndicate was broken, its power shattered in a single violent night. High in the ruined control spire, silence reigned. The twin sons of Kratos were beginning their slow ascent, their pale, early light filtering through the shattered plasteel window, casting long, stark shadows across the room. Ephraim and Eineida stood in the center of it all, the epicenter of the storm that had just passed. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a profound, shared sense of peace. He looked at her. Her vibrant pink skin was smudged with grime and stained with the dark, viscous fluid of Xylosian blood. A fresh cut bled freely from her temple. Her silver hair was a tangled mess. He had never seen anything more beautiful. She looked at him, at the deep bruises already purpling on his face, the scorch marks on his armor, the exhaustion etched around his eyes. She saw the man who had looked into a monster's cage and seen a patient. Without a word, he went to the small med station in the corner of the spire, a luxury Vorlog had afforded himself. He found a clean cloth and a sterile water dispenser. He came back to her and gently, silently began to clean the cut on her temple. His touch was as steady and sure as it had been in the darkness of the cell. She closed her eyes, leaning into his hand. When he was done, she took the cloth from him and began to clean a cut on his cheek, her touch just as tender, just as focused. The gestures were no longer born of grim necessity, but of a deep, abiding affection that needed no words. They were battered, bruised, and utterly drained. The fight for survival was over, and the fight for freedom had been won. All that was left was this quiet moment of shared sanctuary. He sank to the floor, his back against a control console, the strength finally leaving his legs. He was too tired to move. Eineida looked down at him for a long moment, her golden eyes soft in the dawn light. Then she gracefully folded herself down, not beside him, but onto him. She curled up on his chest, her body fitting against his as if it were made to be there. Her head found the hollow of his shoulder, her pointed ear resting directly over the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. It was the first sound she had truly heard in the cell, the one constant in the darkness. It was the sound of her rescue. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. The hard lines of his armor were a cradle, a fortress. She was safe. She was home. A deep sigh escaped her lips, a sound of utter contentment and release. The once feral girl, the legendary champion lost to a waking nightmare, closed her eyes and for the first time in a very long time slept a dreamless sleep, secure in the arms of the man who had refused to see her as anything less than who she was. The suns rose higher, flooding the spire with light, illuminating the final perfect image of their victory. 6 months later, the twin sons of Kratos rose over a world in progress. The brutalist architecture of the arena remained, but its purpose was being reimagined. The blood-soaked sands were gone, replaced by the struggling green shoots of a hydroponic farm, a project constantly facing setbacks. The cells that had once held beings in misery now served as workshops and living quarters, though old rivalries and lingering trauma often sparked conflict within their walls. Kratos was a sanctuary, but a fragile one, governed by a council of former champions led by the steady, weary hand of the old Zokar warrior Grak. Ephraim stood on a balcony overlooking the central commons. The title of Chief Medical Officer was a formal name for a job that was mostly triage and rationing. He had trained a dozen apprentices, sharing human field medicine with species whose biologies were still a mystery to him. He found a profound satisfaction in the work, but it was a grueling, endless task of building something that felt perpetually on the brink of collapse. A pair of warm, strong arms wrapped around his waist from behind. He leaned back into Eineida's embrace. "You are thinking too loud again, Ephraim," she murmured, her voice a low, melodic rumble against his spine. He smiled, placing his hands over hers. "Just inventory. We're low on suture filament again." "A lie," she said gently. "You were looking at the past." He turned in her embrace to face her. 6 months of peace had restored her warrior's physique, and the haunted look was gone from her golden eyes. She wore the simple, functional fatigues of their new security force, a force she commanded. She had reforged her honor not in a single combat, but in the daily, thankless task of mediating disputes and keeping her damaged people safe. "It's hard to believe this is the same place," he admitted. "We are not the same people," she countered softly. Their moment was interrupted by a deep, resonant hum from the sky above. Descending through the atmosphere was a vessel, its design sleek and elegant like a polished silver blade. As it drew closer, a symbol became visible on its hull, the intertwined moons of the Kytan homeworld. A knot of ice formed in Ephraim's stomach. The ship settled beyond the arena walls. Eineida stood frozen beside him, her face an unreadable mask. "They found me," she whispered. The delegation was led by the very matriarch Eineida had failed to protect. They had learned, through interrogating captured slavers, that she had been liberated by a Republic raid weeks after her capture. For months, her first priority had been finding her first blade. The reunion was formal and heart-wrenching. They were here to take her home. That night, the silence in their shared quarters was a heavy blanket. Eineida stood by the window, staring at the glowing Kytan ship. Ephraim came to stand behind her. "You should go," he said, the words tasting like ash. "It's your home, your duty." She turned to face him, her golden eyes flashing with a hurt that wounded him. "Do you truly believe that? Do you think what we have is merely an accident of trauma that should be discarded now that our real lives have come to collect us?" "No," he said, his own pain breaking through. "Gods, no. What we have is the only thing that's ever felt real, and that's why you have to go. Your people need you. I can't be the reason you abandon your oath." "My oath was to protect," she said, her hand cupping his cheek. "In that cell, you protected me. You redefined my oath for me, Ephraim. My fear is not that I will be abandoning my duty if I stay. My fear is that if I go back, I will be abandoning my soul." She pulled him into her arms. "If I leave you, I am leaving the best part of myself behind." The next morning, Eineida requested a formal audience with the matriarch. Ephraim was at her side. She addressed her leader, her voice clear and strong. She reaffirmed her loyalty, but she did not accept their offer to return as she was. "My life was forfeit," she said, her gaze sweeping over the delegates before landing back on her leader. "It was given back to me by this man. My hands, which are sworn to you, are guided by a heart that is sworn to him. We are a unit. We come as one, or I cannot come at all." The chamber was silent. The matriarch stared at them for a long, unblinking moment. Her gaze settled on Ephraim, piercing and analytical. She saw not a lesser being, but the quiet strength that had anchored her greatest warrior. She saw the one who had succeeded where her entire fleet had failed. He had brought her champion back from the dead. A slow, shrewd smile spread across the matriarch's ancient face. "For 6 months I have searched for my lost first blade," she said, her voice resonating with authority and a newfound warmth. "It seems I have found her, and she has brought with her a first shield." She rose and inclined her head, a gesture of profound pragmatic respect. The future was unwritten. Whether their path led to the Kytan homeworld or remained here, on the dusty moon that had been their crucible, was a decision for another day. But the question that had haunted their hearts was answered. They would face it, and everything that came after, together.